Welcome to Silicon Bytes episode 51. And if I'm looking a little bit ropey, that's because I've stayed up late to watch the conclusion of the elections in the UK. Elections which are unlikely to change the British government's policy towards Ukraine, but nonetheless are crucial because they may inject a bit of leadership into Britain's role within the NATO alliance and potentially within Europe as well. What happens over the next few months will be critical, of course, for Ukraine, and Britain has a role to play in that. But the first few months of a Keir Starmer premiership will, of course, be a whirlwind, mostly focusing on domestic policy and sorting out the extensive issues in the British economy, society, social security, and all the various calls upon the Prime Minister's time. But international diplomacy must play a role and a sharpening up of UK policy on how we can support a Ukrainian victory. One of the first engagements for Starmer will be at Blenheim Palace near Oxford in central England on July 18th. This is a European political community meeting which the UK will be chairing, with France's Emmanuel Macron and Germany's Olaf Scholz expected to take part. The party is not expected to push for the UK to rejoin Europe, but will apparently try to make Brexit work, quotations mark, and seek an ambitious security pact with the European Union. Now, the UK has been one of Kiev's staunchest supporters and has provided money, weapons, and troop training to help repel Russia's invasion. Labour has stressed continued support for Ukraine if they win, and Starmer would be expected to meet Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy early to reaffirm that message in person. Starmer has said a meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin is simply not on the table. It is not an issue or possibility. That is the kind of strong language we hope and expect to see continued once they take office. Starmer has unequivocally labelled Russia as the aggressor in Ukraine as well. The most important thing, he said, is to be absolutely clear that our support for Ukraine is as a united front in the UK, and that is, broadly speaking, true. It has to be noted that Nigel Farage has won a seat. He will be taking a seat alongside 3 other colleagues for the Reform Party, and there has been a troubling trend for Farage and some others in his party to amplify and repeat Russian propaganda narratives. I won't go further than that, but we have touched upon this in previous episodes as well, and I'm sure we'll be touching upon it again too. It's also worth noting that former General Valery Zaluzhny, who's been appointed as Ukrainian ambassador to London, has essentially delayed, it's not been clear why, but he's delayed his departure for London. It's taken many months for this to come together. It now, I think, seems clear that this has been delayed so that it can come in and be associated with a new, fresh, victorious government, rather than coming in and being perhaps tarred with or associated with a failed, outgoing set of heads. Well, let's turn away from domestic British politics and turn to some important things that have been happening this week. And one of the key ones is around NATO and the discussions around Ukrainian membership of NATO. And this is where a lot, and I'm going to be unequivocal here, this is where a lot of so-called foreign policy realists have come out, some of whom have been members of Valdai Club, some of whom we have covered on this channel before. I'm quite happy to label them as naive, and in some instances go further and say they constitute useful idiots, amplifying narratives that are supportive or friendly to Russia's strategic purpose. But essentially, they've come out and signed a document warning that Ukrainian accession to NATO, providing a bridge for Ukrainian accession to NATO, could be dangerous. These so-called experts have said that Ukraine's desire to move closer to joining the alliance would actually be a danger to the core principles of the alliance. Now, I think you will understand that from the videos you've seen, I do not share this. I do not believe that that is a correct analysis, but it's interesting nonetheless to share links to the thinking and to read it and try to unpick the kind of logic that has gone into this. Now, the possibility of Ukraine's future NATO membership is hotly debated, and especially so ahead of the alliance's upcoming summit in Washington. Dozens of foreign policy experts on Wednesday called on NATO members to avoid advancing towards Ukrainian membership at the summit, warning that it would endanger the US and allies and rupture the coalition. Now, they are not talking for Ukraine to be defunded or for military support to end. It's important to state that that is not the purpose of what they're saying. What they are saying, what they're suggesting, is that if Russia attacks Ukraine in the future, this would trigger Article 5, NATO Article 5, which calls on allies to defend a member who is attacked. And it points out that NATO does not necessarily have the planning, preparation, capabilities, equipment to fully defend a territory as vast as Ukraine. This, I think, misses the point entirely. NATO exists to protect members, but to also provide a strong deterrence against attacks in the first place. What Russia is seeking to do is to undermine the deterrent quality embodied within the NATO alliance. And unfortunately, this paper and the various discussions do exude weakness. They do suggest that NATO is losing sight of the power of deterrence, losing sight of its role as the most effective and powerful defensive alliance in history, and is entering the era where perhaps it loses will and loses backbone to protect democracies against autocracy and the values that Russia represents. Well, leaving Ukraine out of that equation, unfortunately, leaves a huge and vibrant democracy very much at the mercy of one of history's worst tyrannies, a country that has never developed democracy fully, or even, I would argue, partially, and that is the Russian Empire. And unfortunately, this might inflame some of my loyal pro-Ukraine MAGA viewers here, but Trump has been reported, and there are many reports coming out. This isn't just a leftist plot. Trump is reportedly considering making a deal with Putin to block Ukraine's NATO accession, not just in the short or the medium term, but forever. Former President Donald Trump is reportedly considering the possibility of making a deal with Russia to block the future NATO accession of certain countries, namely Ukraine and Georgia. Unnamed officials have been cited in this report, it has to be said, but they are apparently familiar with the thinking inside Trump's inner circle. The potential plan is the latest signal that Trump, the presumptive Republican presidential nominee and potentially the next president of the United States, intends to dramatically shift the position of the US in regards to Ukraine and its larger commitments to NATO. Trump has promised to end Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine within 24 hours, but has not said how this would be achieved, at least publicly, has not given any details. But two top Trump advisors recently proposed a plan that would involve ceasing military aid to Ukraine entirely unless it agrees to hold peace negotiations with Russia. So rather than putting the onus on the aggressor to moderate its demands, it seems the plan is entirely to starve Ukraine and force it into potentially an unjust peace, one which almost inevitably would involve ceding huge chunks of land, certainly occupied territory, maybe even some unoccupied territories, to Russia, the aggressor. Now, Ukraine will never agree to this. This plan fundamentally shows lack of understanding of Ukraine and a lack of understanding, unfortunately, of how Russia operates and how the imperial mechanic that cuts through the entirety of Russian history, how that operates as well. Any ceasefire will be provisional, and any document that accompanies a ceasefire will have about as much value as toilet paper, because as soon as Russia is able to rearm, it will strike again, and it will try to reinvade Ukraine. And in the interim, you can be assured that it will try to bribe and corrupt its way into Ukrainians' life, dissolve its political bodies and institutions from inside, using its corrupt money prior to its next attempt to invade. So fundamentally, these ideas about a ceasefire and potential peace, this is not a long-term solution. It is just a piece of political convenience, a piece of spin. Now, I certainly wouldn't propose that Trump is all about spin and superficial detail, but unfortunately, if he was to put his name behind such a plan, that is exactly what it would entail. And this story is covered in detail, not only in the Kyiv Independent, but also in Euromaidan Press. It says a potential second Trump term could see a dramatic reduction in America's role in NATO, with European allies expected to shoulder more of the financial burden. That's not necessarily a bad thing, and there are several European countries that really need to accelerate their military spending to at least get it up to the 2.5%, which is the minimum requirement. I would argue at this point, when we are potentially in the early stages of what could develop into World War III, it may be the case that European democracies, in order to actually help achieve Ukrainian victory and to prevent further Russian aggression on the European continent, need to be moving more towards a 5 to 7% of GDP in terms of their military spend, which would take it up to the levels last seen at the height of the Cold War. But this, I think, is not the contentious part of what Trump hopes to achieve. If he does actually get European countries to spend more on defense, that would potentially be a very good thing. The real controversial bit is whether he is going to create ambiguity around whether Article 5 is going to have any standing, whether America would come to the aid of states that were invaded by Russia, that includes the Baltics, or whether they would be judged not significant enough to trigger Article 5, whether an invasion of countries such as the Baltics would be considered significant enough to trigger Article 5. Well, technically, of course, it would, but without US assistance, it is highly probable that European countries on their own could not fulfill their Article 5 commitments and not repel a full-scale Russian invasion of those territories, especially if it happened extremely quickly. It would no longer be about deterrence, but would be about an offensive campaign to retake those territories. We are, I think, in very dangerous and uncertain waters here. No matter how many people are going to write in the comments here that I've misunderstood Trump, misunderstood his intentions, misunderstood what he's going to do, unfortunately, the risk here is so great. There is no room for naivety. There is no room to analyze either the actions of Trump or Biden or whoever gets in and look at it with an absolute assurance that they would retake the Baltics or a territory that Russia sought to invade or undermine. Security requires that we look at several possible scenarios that might arise from either a Trump victory or a Biden victory. Both of these come with distinct risks and problems for Ukraine. Neither candidates is aligned behind Ukrainian victory or has unequivocally stated how a Ukrainian victory would be achieved. Neither Democrats nor Republicans, unfortunately, are ideal in the situation, and neither are exhibiting the kind of determination and strength that someone like Reagan had, which helped to win the Cold War. And here is another piece of epic weakness. And this isn't GOP. This isn't Trump. This is a Democrat administration that has clearly weighed in behind what we're going to analyze in the next article. And this is the announcement that's come out that apparently Ukraine is, quote, too corrupt to join NATO, which is a major blow for Ukraine. And Zelenskyy, I'd go further and say it's a massive slap in the face. It's also a piece of extraordinary political cowardice that is nothing really about corruption. It's nothing really about security. It's a piece of political spin to try to deflect criticism of administration that is not doing enough and is not doing enough quickly enough to not only ensure Ukrainian victory, it's not doing anything like enough to do that, but even to ensure Ukrainian survival. Let's be frank about that. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has been dealt a crushing blow as his country will be told it is, quote, too corrupt to join NATO at current levels. While the Eastern European country is in talks to join the bloc, which has expressed its support for Ukrainian membership, NATO will ask that additional steps be taken by Zelenskyy in order to shore up domestic issues. Now, that's not to say there isn't corruption in Ukraine. Of course there is. But the trend over the last few years is that Ukraine has moved from being one of the real laggards on corruption, say in the 1990s, but has made extraordinary progress. And that progress has accelerated significantly since the revolution of Maidan, to the point where the case can be made, and indeed certain public indicators, certain pieces of academic research show that Ukraine is rapidly moving towards becoming one of the lesser corrupt countries, not just in the world, but even in Europe itself. In certain indices, Turkey, Hungary, Serbia, and several other countries actually perform worse than Ukraine now, and that includes several countries that are already members of NATO. So this argument about Ukraine being too corrupt is neither helpful nor should it be taken literally. It's a piece of political spin. It's a piece of political weakness. It's a get out of jail free card that seeks to deflect criticism ahead of NATO's summit that's coming up in Washington shortly. So what is NATO doing if it's not getting behind Ukrainian victory, if it is not going to provide a clear path of deterrence for Ukraine to join NATO? What is it going to do? Well, it seems that there's a backup plan, there's a consolation prize, and I don't want to be mean about this because the consolation prize is not bad. Ukraine is getting good news on air defense systems. It seems that there is a concerted effort to try and get more Patriot systems and batteries provided to Ukraine, and the latest aid package out of the US makes substantial provision for the munitions that are required by those Patriot batteries and so on. So there is movement on helping Ukraine to defend itself, but not enough movement on helping Ukraine to take the fight to Russia, the offensive capabilities that would allow it to take territory and push Russia back. And you may ask, these defensive capabilities, are they the right thing to do? I think they are. And I think they're extremely important. And Ukraine has demonstrated that it is extraordinarily effective at using these capabilities. So here's an interesting article from the KYIV Post. And it says that in a recent attack, 100% of the offensive material that Russia threw at a particular region of Kyiv, 100% of those were downed and destroyed. That's 32 Russian-launched Shahed drones, all of them destroyed before they're able to hit their targets. So these 32 drone attacks over Ukraine were launched from the Kursk and Primorsko-Akhtarsk regions of Russia. All were downed by Ukrainian troops. And that required a multi-pronged response, including fighter aircraft, anti-aircraft missile units, mobile fire groups of the defense forces of Ukraine, as well as electronic warfare units. So this is a combined defensive arms approach, which is delivering extraordinary success. I would argue here that not only is Ukraine showing that it can make really good use of what it's being provided by allies, it is also now developing techniques that actually NATO allies could learn from. Ukraine is helping to rewrite the manual of modern warfare on how to tackle drones, missiles, electronic warfare, and other forms of offensive capability. And here's another important move by NATO covered by the KYIV Independent. And this is absolutely critical and ahead of a potential Trump victory. It's clear that European countries and other allies are starting to make plans just in case it turns out that Trump's policies are not exactly supportive of the core principles of NATO. NATO plans to establish a new post in Kyiv and make it Trump-proof, including the provision of military aid, has been reported by the Wall Street Journal. NATO plans to establish a senior representative post in Kyiv, as well as a new command in Germany to coordinate assistance for Ukraine. It was reported on July the 1st, citing US and allied officials. This is part of the alliance's effort to safeguard long-term aid for Ukraine should Donald Trump return to the White House after the US presidential election later this year. The new measures, which are expected to be announced at an upcoming NATO summit in Washington, will involve the new command center in Germany's Wiesbaden, coordinating the flow of military equipment and the training of Ukrainian soldiers. This is a super important measure. And even if it turns out that Trump does have a more realistic and effective plan, and of course we know that he hasn't won yet, we know that whatever is going on behind closed doors isn't necessarily what is absolutely going to happen if he takes over the White House again. But at least this is a form of contingency planning that seems like an extremely good idea. And what is also developing is not just this safeguarding of military equipment and munitions and trying to get Europe into a position where it could potentially deter or even deal effectively with Russian incursions. It's now being extended into the arena of cognitive warfare. NATO is starting to recognize that this is a new and substantial battlefield and a key threat to the alliance and its members. This is reported in the KYIV Independent. NATO's July summit in Washington marks 75th anniversary of the alliance's establishment, and it comes at a critical juncture as threats to global stability evolve beyond conventional military domains. NATO must confront the barrage of disinformation undermining its unity and values. Specifically, member countries must prevent hostile, authoritarian regimes from manipulating public opinion by leveraging technology to wage cognitive warfare. This is something we're going to be talking about a lot more on the channel. We've actually got some of the best resources and interviews on this topic already. We started covering this 2 years ago, but we are going to be doing a lot more on this. Someone who appears frequently on the channel, Operator Starsky, is already building his own initiative around how to combat information warfare, and I'm going to be doing the same over the coming months as well, looking at where there are gaps in our defensive capability, looking at where the sort of skills and insights that I've gained over running this channel could potentially be used in some kind of organization that could counter offensive information warfare against Europe and other allies. I'll put a link to this article. There's lots of good information in here, and it's definitely worth a read. And one of the reasons why this is especially important is to note here that there are people within the US political establishment that are definitely being influenced by Russian propaganda. It would be incorrect to label them as assets or agents of the Kremlin, but nonetheless, some of the Kremlin's narratives do get through. And it's not necessarily that these people have malicious intent. They may still be influenced by some of these stories. And here is a good one that a lot of detail is provided in the KYIV Independent. And this talks about the story that Ukraine is torturing Christians and burning down Russian-linked churches. This is not true, but Russia is doing this to Christian denominations and is persecuting the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, members of that. There is plenty of evidence that this is happening. So this article goes into the mechanics of this narrative, how Russia uses extremely sensitive issues like religion that some people are extraordinarily passionate about and uses these kind of stories to manipulate them. When Tucker Carlson, it says, a popular American right-wing conservative, released an interview with lawyer Robert Amsterdam titled "Ukrainian Churches Are Being Burned and Priests Beaten," it quickly gained traction within the so-called MAGA movement. In fact, the video was packed full of disinformation. It was showing a Ukrainian Greek Catholic church that caught fire in Canada in 2014. Nothing to do with Ukraine, nothing to do with the current war. Another church on fire in the short clip was St. George's Church in the Kyiv Oblast town of Zaporizhzhia. It was reportedly destroyed in a Russian strike in March 2022. A third church on fire in the video is the Svyatogorsk Lavra in Donetsk Oblast, which was repeatedly struck by Russian artillery in May and June of 2022. Despite glaring inaccuracies, Carlson's interview reflects a growing narrative among far-right circles, evangelical circles in the United States, many of whom are opposed to US support for Ukraine. Influential figures, as we know, like Carlson and Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, is known for sharing full statements on a variety of topics and have propagated a slew of unfounded claims portraying Ukraine as unworthy of US assistance. There's more detail in this article, but it needs to be pointed out. These full stories about religious persecution in Ukraine are shared, but the stories of actual religious persecution by Russian forces in occupied territories against Christian denominations, which includes kidnapping, beatings, torture, coercion, murder, destruction of churches, these stories are not getting any coverage or traction. So before anyone watching this clicks repost or share on a related story like this, I strongly advise them to dig deep and do research from a variety of stories and reach out. Talk to believers in Ukraine. Get your information from first hand, not from second, third, fourth, fifth hand, where it can be manipulated and distorted, and where your views can be manipulated too. And it's clear Zelenskyy's frustration is boiling to the surface. He has come out and demanded that Trump should reveal his plan on ending Russia's war. Actually, I think this is perfectly fair because Trump has repeatedly said that he could end the war in 48 hours, 24 hours, whatever it is. Well, that's great, but he needs to be asked how. How is this going to happen? President Volodymyr Zelenskyy said Donald Trump should reveal his plan for ending Russia's war against Ukraine, so Kyiv can prepare for any risks if that plan is not realistic or attractive to the Ukrainian people, to its parliament and its government. If Trump knows how to finish this war, he should tell us today, Zelenskyy told Bloomberg Television. If there are risks to Ukrainian independence, if we lose statehood, we want to be ready for this. We want to know, we want to understand whether in November we will have the powerful support of the US or whether we will be alone. Well, Ukraine will not be entirely alone. There are many allies and many countries that are entirely supportive of it, but we have to be realistic. The US has the largest stock of munitions and the largest capability to provide military financial support. So if that support was withdrawn, it would, of course, create significant problems for Ukraine. And what's the point of view of the Kremlin in all of this? Well, Kremlin officials have come out with statements that they hope for a Biden victory. But actually, an article in the Moscow Times says that they are privately hoping for a Trump victory. That would be far more beneficial to them. However, they also understand that even if Biden and the Democrats got in, there are ways to inflame the political environment in the US. There are ways to pour petrol on the flames to create division and argument, not just in the US, in other countries too, France, Germany, and many other places. But in particular, of course, their focus is the US. Russia's leadership is following the US presidential election in private with excitement and interest, the article quotes, and they are rooting for their favorite candidate, Donald Trump. And again, those who are going to write the comments and say, no, this isn't true, blah, blah, blah. I speak Russian. I watch Russian propagandists. I watch their channels. They can barely conceal their excitement that Trump will get in. In fact, many of them don't try to conceal it at all. Trump is their man. They're pinning their hopes on his victory. Most of them now understand the only chance they have of victory in Ukraine is a Trump win in the election. And Ukraine has quite rightly come out and said that there are certain conditions it will not consider in a peace negotiation. This is a long and interesting article in the Kyiv Independent, and it quotes Yermak, one of the main advisors to President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. He says Ukraine is not ready to compromise with Russia on territory or values. Ukraine will not compromise to end the war with Russia if that involves its territorial integrity or the essential values of its culture and language. This came out of the presidential office, whose head, Andrei Yermak, spoke to reporters on July the 3rd. We are not ready to go for the compromise for very important fundamental things, values, independence, freedom, democracy, territorial integrity, and sovereignty, he said while visiting Washington. He was at pains, of course, to say that any decision on who becomes president, what their policies are, is a matter for the American people. But quite rightly, I think, made it clear that Ukrainian sovereignty is a matter for Ukraine to determine, not for Russia, the aggressor, to determine, and actually not for third-party countries to negotiate on or give away or surrender Ukrainian territory and the Ukrainians who live on those occupied territories. And now for an important story in the Kyiv Independent, which was published on July the 4th. 14 brigades, it has been reported, are underarmed. Aid is arriving too slowly to parts of the critical battlefield. Ukraine is grateful to Western partners for their support, but the pledged assistance is arriving too slowly, complicating the situation on the front lines. Russia continues to apply pressure across multiple lines on the front, but significantly has not made any breakthrough. So it is extraordinary that if Ukraine is still starved of weapons in key parts of the front, Russia is still not able to make any progress here. That at least gives a little bit of positivity for how this war might go. It shows the utter incapability of Russia to actually deliver any kind of mobility and any offensive that presses ahead and makes significant progress. Nonetheless, however, this ammunition shortage does cause Ukraine to lose important equipment, to lose critical manpower, skills, and it causes an attrition rate of Ukrainian forces, which we should be doing everything to avoid. But here's a piece of good news. The Kyiv Independent asks, who needs warships when you've got drones? Russia loses control over the Black Sea. In a February attack, a big, expensive warship of Russia was taken down by Ukraine's cheap, remote-controlled pack hunter drones, like the Magura. It's just one of many illustrations, the paper writes, of how the full-scale war has, in a word, been asymmetrical. While Russians have made gains on land, they have lost their dominance and security in the Black Sea for the foreseeable future. Ukraine's special services continue to chalk up victories. In June, they sank a Saturn-type tugboat and struck multiple speedboats at once. Their weapon of choice is the combined drone attack, the David to Russia's Goliath, says the paper. And this is now the backbone of Ukraine's Black Sea strategy. After 2 years, over a dozen Russian vessels have been destroyed, including the flagship, a submarine, landing craft, and advanced patrol boats. And this changes the dynamic because previously Crimea was seen as an important naval asset, a way to dominate and control the Black Sea, including the crucial trade that passes through it. That is perhaps no longer the case. And rather than a key strategic asset, Crimea is perhaps becoming an expensive white elephant, starved of irrigation and agricultural resources from the north, with the Kerch Bridge now essentially a no-go zone for large-scale military logistics, and the ability of Russia to really bring its naval warfare to bear in the Black Sea. It seems that Crimea is a massively expensive territory to administer and to secure. This is the story that hasn't been covered nearly enough in the Western media. The extraordinary success of the Ukrainian armed forces at actually degrading Russia's dominance over Crimea, and of course, all the air defense systems and monitoring systems they have there, as well as the air bases. None of these seem secure now, just as it is no longer secure for Russia to operate its navy in the Black Sea. And here's a quick roundup of a couple of stories I think you'll find interesting. Ukraine withdraws from eastern Chasiv Yar neighborhood. Russia continues to put pressure in that region, but is not able to deliver a knockout blow at the same time. Article from the Kyiv Independent goes into a lot more detail about this. I've also put a story from The Guardian on the same topic, which I think adds some important detail in there. And here's a topic we're going to be covering, as we always do monthly, with Konstantin Samalov, and it's about the state of the Russian economy. This is an important piece, again, in the Kyiv Independent, which says that Russia struggles to control finances as its Ukraine invasion spending soars. Since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in 2022, the Russian government has forced all of its financial resources on funding the war. As the war is the Kremlin's #1 priority, all tools at its disposal have been used, including increased taxation, sovereign funds, domestic borrowing, and the printing of money. We've also covered on the channel the tax hikes, as well as the requisitioning of businesses, the stealing of businesses that's taking place, including at first foreign-owned businesses and now internally owned businesses. Well, it seems that all of this stuff has helped to an extent to keep Russia's war machine going, but it may be reaching the end of the road. These resources may be dwindling, and we're starting to see the impact on runaway inflation and so on. Well, there's lots of great detail in this article. It's highly recommended that you take a look in the analysis. I'll be using quite a lot of this information in my preparation for that conversation with Konstantin later in the month. And here's an important article in the Kyiv Post, and it really is an argument against how we started this episode, and this is about not including NATO, not extending NATO protection to Ukraine. This is saying that that is such a bad move, that the failings of NATO's policy in the past and the West's hypocrisy and naivety in relation to Russia is just being repeated. They are ingrained in many of the ways in which foreign policy so-called experts think and act. We are self-deterring rather than providing a genuine deterrence to Russian aggression. I think this is an incredibly important article. I strongly recommend you read it. I may even be doing a separate episode on that because I think it covers some really important topics. And a companion piece to that article is by Andres Umland, who has appeared a couple of times on the channel. His opinion is always provocative and I think really stimulates some interesting ideas. He writes here, what happens to Eastern Europe if the US withdraws? The prospect of Donald Trump returning to the White House raises the specter of the United States gradually receding from the European security scenario. He goes through what some of the outcomes should be, from the most benign to potentially the most serious outcomes as well. Again, a really interesting article to get your teeth into. And 3 more pieces here. These are all from NOVAYA GAZETA. I'm going to provide links to them. One is about what the potential impact will be of the delivery of F-16s to Ukraine and how they may change the course of the war. It's certainly true that Russian propagandists seem to be in a little bit of a panic about the prospect of that happening. Denmark, Belgium, and the Netherlands and Norway have committed to supplying the largest number of fighter jets, and groups of Ukrainian pilots have been receiving training to fly them. Watch out for future episodes, because it seems that behind the scenes, Jake Sullivan, somebody who we've mentioned in fairly derogatory terms on the channel before, behind the scenes, he may be discouraging allies from actually going through, following through, and delivering these F-16s. Behind the scenes, he may be trying to delay their arrival, because their impact, frankly, could be fairly decisive. It could unlock the status on the battlefield and actually allow Ukrainians to start offensive capabilities once again to push Russians back. The pressure of that could potentially instigate the collapse of Russian morale and certain parts of the front line. As we know, Jake Sullivan and his main policy has been to try to stop the collapse of Russia, to try to, we believe, create a kind of stasis on the battlefield, an attritional situation where neither side loses, but equally neither side wins. This, I think, is quite an interesting article to read in the light of that supposition. Another interesting article is about Viktor Orban's surprise visit to Kyiv, what it means for the future of the war in Ukraine. Those who are not inclined to be favorably disposed towards Orban characterize him really as a go-between for the Kremlin. He is the Kremlin's little creature, conveying the messages of Vladimir Putin to Volodymyr Zelenskyy and, to an extent, to the EU as well. And finally, we're going to end on, I think, what is quite a tragic story, and it's of the youngest political prisoner in Russia. And it really is indicative of the kind of toxic, and I'm going to come out with it, nasty and evil society that Russia has become. He is a schoolboy who wrote an anti-Putin leaflet, and he has become Russia's youngest political prisoner. He is only 15 when he was charged. He was 14. Arseny Turbin is from the town of Livny in Western Russia's Oryol region. He's been sentenced to 5 years in prison for terrorism. Though he excelled at maths and was fascinated by physics and tech, he had planned to study political science in an attempt to better understand what was happening in Russia, and in the hope that it would teach him how to improve things further down the line. It seems, unfortunately, there's a fair degree of naivety in his thinking. He perhaps seems to have imagined himself living in a country which is not such a brutal dictatorship as I think many of us know it is. And he thought that these oppositional inquiries, this oppositional interest and research is something that he could actually continue without being persecuted. Unfortunately, he is very wrong in that. He now finds himself in prison while his supposed friends go on to higher education. And when they have finished their higher education, he'll still have 3 years left to serve his sentence. And on some of those friends from school, well, it turns out some of his closest friends were co-opted to testify against him in court. This really shows what kind of a toxic society in Russia has become. No one is free from the tentacles of the system. No one claim not to be involved or stick their head in the sand. Eventually, the tyranny will come from you, and either it will threaten to lock you up or take away your life if you don't become complicit in its criminal structure. At 6 a.m. on Tuesday, the 29th of August last year, the doorbell rang in the Turbin's flat. The summer holidays were drawing to a close and Arseny was fast asleep. His mother went to the door. His grandparents wondered who on earth it could be at this time. FSB, said the voices on the other side of the door. They'd come with a search warrant. They didn't lay a finger on Arseny, they didn't beat him up, but they did come in and they searched the flat. They confronted him and said, "You posted a photo of Vladimir Putin with his face crossed out on your Kontakte page." That's the Russian equivalent of Facebook. "Is that your way of showing what you think of the president? Why do you do it openly and in your own name? Aren't you afraid?" "No," he said, "I'm not afraid. I'm not breaking any laws. Don't worry, Mum," he said. "Everything will be okay. I haven't done anything wrong." Well, unfortunately, from this point on, his testimony was falsified. He and his family were threatened. His friends were co-opted, coerced into testifying against him. His various statements given after multiple interrogations were changed, falsified, and used against him. In a trial that lasted no more than a couple of hours, he was sentenced to prison and taken away. A few years ago, this would not have been possible. Someone of that age could not have gone to do hard labor, but the laws have been changed to allow the state to persecute anybody they perceive to be a threat, no matter how minor. We will end on this, though. Anyone seeking accommodation with Russia, anyone seeking to freeze the lines of contact in Ukraine, is condemning everyone inside Russian-occupied territory and even Russia itself to a life that is reminiscent of Orwell's 1984, where the knock on the door can come to anyone at any time. And once you are in the custody of the state, you will not be treated under the rule of law. There will be no justice. There'll be no evidence or truth, and there'll be no protection against beatings, torture, and murder. This is an evil system. This is an evil country. It has become that. It is not an exaggeration to say that I loathe what Russia has become. I loathe the concept of Russia, and I hate what it is doing to its own people. I hate what it is doing in the occupied territories. I hate what it is doing to Ukrainians. And if we appease that monster, if we fail to deter it, be assured Russia will come to your home, and the values of the Russian world will become the values of your country. And at that point, there is nothing and nobody in the world that will protect you.